This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 9, entitled Globist Agenda, taken from my second book, entitled Multis and Monos, What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Towards the Creation of a Global State. This is chapter 9, part 1. Chapter 9, Globa's Agenda. So subtopic headings: A. Introduction. B. Global Ethics and Propaganda. C. Global Nuclear Disarmament. D. Banning the Global Arms Trade. E. Global Environmental Challenges. F. Global Poverty Elimination. G. Global Taxation. H. Global Incomes and Raw Materials Policy. I. Global Education. J. Global Population Migration. K. From Global Economics to Global Happiness. L. Globa and Nanotechnology. M. Globa and the Intellect. N. Global Civil War? A. Introduction. This chapter is devoted to the topic of what a global state, once it has come into being, should do. That is, what should its agenda be? What tasks should a global state be expected to perform on a planetary scale that a single nation state would be too small to perform? This chapter discusses many such agenda items, which are now summarized briefly. Following the summary are the section describing each agenda item in turn. Section B talks about the basic values of a global state and how they could be consolidated. Section C tackles the most important and immediate threat to human survival, namely the continued existence of the nuclear stockpile that needs to be eliminated. Section D is devoted to the moral necessity of getting rid of the global arms trade, one of the greatest moral abhorrences of the nation-state system. Section E discusses what the planet needs to do to survive the coming catastrophes due to climate change if we don't cut our greenhouse gas emissions, etc. That is, the need to confront the considerable challenges of our traditional abuse of the environment. Section F then talks about the longer-term goals of eliminating global poverty, that is, making all citizens of the planet materially wealthy. Section G is concerned with the more economic and political question of a global taxation system and its policies, that is, who should pay how much for what. Section H is related to G and is concerned with incomes and raw materials policy. For example, how much money should be transferred from the rich countries to the poor countries? It introduces the notion that the raw materials of the planet belong to the citizens of the world, not the nation-state in which the raw materials are found. Section I deals with global education, that is, how to educate the planet so that all the world's citizens can be educated to the limits of their abilities. Section J deals with the idea that the overcrowded countries should be diluted so that the less populated areas can be augmented by people from the more populated areas. Section K shifts the emphasis a bit by talking about a change away from the usual economic issues to psychological issues, that is, the importance of arranging global politics so that people's happiness is important, so that policies are formulated to raise the general happiness level of the world's citizens. Sections L and M are more futuristic, dealing with the rise and global political impact of nanotechnology, that's molecular scale engineering, and then the rise of the intellects, that is, massively intelligent machines. Section N speculates on the possibility of a global civil war over the issue of intellect policy, that is, should humanity build intellects or not. Note that there is some overlap between this chapter and chapter 6 that was devoted to globe and institutions, because of course to implement an agenda the corresponding institutions need to be created. B. Global Ethics and Propaganda. One of the first things that a newly establishing global state would need to do would be to consolidate its values, its ethical standards, because they'll be strongly needed to complete many of the tasks to be explained in later sections. Globism is an ideology that opposes nationalism, so the two ideologies will inevitably be at loggerheads. Globism is the ideology that favours the creation of a global state. Nationalism is the ideology that favours the nation-state, a particular nation-state, usually at the expense of other nation-states. From the point of view of a globist, nationalists are usually monos, and hence seem ignorant and biased in favour of the one nation-state they are so partial to. To a multi who has seen many nationalisms, nationalism as an ideology seems limited, ignorant, and even bigoted. Imagine how it feels for a multi who has already seen French monos saying with passion, "Vive la France!" Long live France, and German monos saying with equal passion, often directed against the French, "Deutschland über alles!" Germany above everyone. Or Brit monos saying with stiff upper lips, "Britain rules the waves!" Or Japanese with their "Nippon Ichiban!" Japan is best. To see yet another nationalism, for example, American monos screaming out, "USA! USA!" That multi would probably feel alienated and bored. To multis, the nationalisms of the monos are seen as being limited, small-minded, and rather contemptible. Multis can see that nationalisms serve certain purposes. For example, they create a sense of bonding in the group, express a certain pride if the nation concerned is genuinely superior in some respects relative to others. But nationalisms can be destructive. Look at the damage they did leading up to the start of World War I. Germany was very late in becoming a nation, that is, a century or more after France and England. The Germans then pushed their nationalism very strongly to make up for lost time. So what can the globalists do to counter the strength of nationalism? They can make themselves visible, that is, known to the general public, so that everyone in time is conscious that there are lots of people who would like to live in a global state and who consider nationalistic expression to be politically adolescent and unsophisticated. For example, as I mentioned in Chapter 7, I remember being in a classical music concert in Salt Lake City in Utah, in the US, and was shocked to hear the orchestra play the US national anthem. I'd never heard of that at any European or Japanese concert. The globist in me sneered inwardly, so I did not stand up. I was the only person in the whole concert hall who did not stand. I was in the front row of a side balcony, so I guess I was readily visible. The conductor glared at me as though I was a Martian. To him I suppose I was. I was a six-cultured multi. Well then, that was before I moved to China. The thought occurred to me to speak out, saying something like, "I'm not an American. I'm not even a nationalist. I'm a globist. I'd like to live in a global state." In practice I didn't say anything and gave him back a look that expressed something like, "You're such a peasant." But as globism spreads, other globists will almost certainly become more militant and choose to react differently. For example, if they hear some expression of nationalism, e.g. the national anthem, they might call out loudly, "Monos!" Once many people understand what the term means, and that is to be taken as an insult, then consciously or unconsciously the nationalists would get the message that there now exists a group of people who think that being nationalist is to be rather narrow-minded, to be ignorant. If lots of people yell out, "Monos!" at national anthems, then one can imagine the nationalists thinking, "Those globists are so rude." But that implies that the nationalists are aware that the globists exist, of what they're trying to do, what they disapprove of, that is nationalism, and that they are trying to make the nationalists think more broad-mindedly, that is globally. Of course, yelling "Monos!" at the national anthem is very small beer. What would be far more effective would be getting the globist message into books, such as this one, and into the media, to persuade people to think more globally. In order to create a global state, the above consciousness raising would be needed, but that is only the beginning. Far more important is the need to create a global media, a global language, a globally homogeneous culture, etc. To achieve this will require the support of billions of people who are sympathetic, even enthusiastic, to the creation of a global state. To convert billions of people from today's nation-state mentality, from monocultured nationalism to a multi-globalism, will take a lot of persuasion. The leaders of multinational blocs, for example, the EU, European Union, fight fire with fire. Instead of actively trying to discourage single nation-state nationalisms, they attempt to replace them by upgrading them to a higher supranationalism with a union anthem. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. That's the Beethoven's Ninth. All people will become brothers from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. An EU flag, 12 yellow stars in a circle with a blue background. EU passports, even proposals for EU number plates on cars. In terms of ethics, the globists need to push ideas such as all human beings are global citizens, all are of equal value under the law, and that all are worthy of receiving the benefit of the world's resources and raw materials. This kind of thinking would run counter to the idea, for example, of an Arab saying, "The oil lies under Arab land, so it belongs to the Arabs." Globist generosity would run counter to nationalist selfishness. It would go against the grain of the attitude that charity begins at home, discussed in section H of chapter 7. The globists would need to keep up a fairly strong propaganda campaign to see these values become generally accepted around the world. Globist intellectuals, sages, would need to write globist books and journal articles. Globist journalists would need to write articles for TV, radio, the web, newspapers and magazines, etc. Globist teachers and professors would need to teach globist principles and values to their students. Globist politicians would need to propagate globist principles in their political careers. Even better, they should create whole political parties devoted to globism. So important is the concept. Once globist political parties are formed, they will have a much stronger influence on political policy than having individual globist politicians working within other parties. The creation of a global state is one of the most important political developments of the 21st century, so a vast globist political movement is needed to bring it into being. The globists will need all the propaganda they can muster. C. Global nuclear disarmament. The planet still has so many nuclear warheads as a result of the build-up during the Cold War that we could kill everyone on the planet multiple times over. Compared with the paranoia of the 1950s, today's fear of a nuclear holocaust or a nuclear winter is a lot less. But that does not mean that the danger is over. Russia and the US both still have many thousands of warheads. The risk of an accidental launching is still a possibility. If Side A launches a few missiles accidentally, then the other Side B may launch consciously and massively. Then, because Side B has launched massively, Side A will also launch massively. Then everyone dies. One of the first things a global state needs to do is to get rid of the global nuclear arsenal. It is so dangerous. Of course, this is not something that will happen overnight. A prerequisite for nuclear disarmament is sufficient trust on the part of rival parties that they both agree to stand down their weapons, and probably in stages. For example, both agree to reduce the number of their warheads by 10%, then another 10%, and so on. As the global media and a global language become more widespread, the general trust level between countries should increase, so that nuclear disarmament can become a reality, even if a stage one, an incremental one. Once globist political parties come into being, high on their agenda should be the disarmament of the planet's nuclear arsenal, so that humanity can survive. To be safe, the globists and other parties should also push for the creation of a self-sufficient human colonies on other worlds, so that if there is a nuclear holocaust on the Earth, then at least there is another human colony elsewhere to carry on the human genes, so that the human species survives. D. Banning the global arms trade. One of the great governmental crimes of our era is the global arms trade. Even the US and the EU are major criminals in this regard. Both sell billions of dollars/euros worth of non-nuclear arms, small weapons, ammunition, tanks, planes, etc. a year to mostly third world countries at war with other third world countries. This makes them death merchants. It is as great a moral abomination as is slavery, and in fact it's worse, because at least many of the slaves survive their ordeal. By definition, the arms trade is selling arms to people who want to kill other people. That is a crime, yet even so-called civilized national governments do it, and do it on the largest scale. The largest arms sellers are the US, the EU, Russia, etc. Why do such civilized nations commit such horrible crimes and turn a blind eye, profiting from the billions of euros/dollars? Because, they argue, if we don't do it, then certainly other countries will, and make huge profits, billions of dollars, thousands of jobs. It's a fact of life in our current phase of history that there are nation-states, and that some of them are at war with each other, and need arms, and are willing to pay big bucks for them. If you want to get rid of the global arms trade, you would have to create a global state, or at least have the major powers agree on a global arms trade ban. We're not there yet, so the arms trade continues. The above logic cannot be faulted, it's valid. So then one of the major aims of the globalists, once they create their global state, or close to it, will be to ban the global arms trade. They can start with the major political/economic blocs once they become big enough. If the US, EU and Russia could agree to not sell arms, that would be a major start. Together, they could then put powerful moral, political and economic pressure on other countries that continue to sell arms. For example, if China took advantage of the lack of sales of arms by the Big Three, then the Big Three could refuse to export high-tech products to China, etc. The global arms trade is the 21st century's moral equivalent to the slave trade of the 19th century. It's a moral outrage and needs to be wiped out. But it's not going to happen until the above argument, that is, if we don't do it, others will, can be squashed. The most effective way to squash it is with the creation of a global state, or at least to go sufficiently far along that path. E. Global environmental challenges. At the time of writing, the concept of climate change, or what used to be called global warming, has become topical. Discussion of this issue is now flooding the media. It has become hot, this is in 2007, in the sense of becoming popular. The phenomenon of global warming, the greenhouse gas effect, the emission of CO2 from cars and coal-burning power stations, the melting of the polar ice caps and the world's glaciers, etc., will have catastrophic effects when the sea level rises, displacing many millions of people, making them refugees on a scale unheard of. These phenomena are truly global, hence need a global solution. The total amount of CO2 poured into the atmosphere each year needs to be brought down, so the nations of the globe need to get together and make agreements on how to lower the total. The Kyoto Accord was one such agreement, but not all large emitter nations agreed, particularly the US, the largest offender. Fairly soon, at the time of writing, China will be pouring more CO2 into the atmosphere than the US or Europe. Living 10 years later, that's now the case. The world's largest polluter in CO2 terms is China. Once a global state has been formed, it will be a lot easier to get nations to follow a common policy, because the policy will come from the global state. This state will be thinking globally, and not in the selfish interests of individual nation-states, who too often feel, to hell with the planet. It will be a democratically elected state, with the citizens of the whole planet deciding on what should be done. A global state is most suited to dealing with global issues like global climate change. It can make global decisions and by force of global law force everyone to obey that law. It's obvious now that the total quantity of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere needs to be lowered. A global state can simply pass a law that the emission rate needs to be lowered by X% in Y years, and then ensure that it happens. Those countries not obeying the law will be heavily fined, and the national leaders dismissed from office as punishment. Such is the power of a global state, a democratically elected global state, not a global dictatorship, and living as, for example, as envisaged by the NWO, the New World Order, that is a global fascist dictatorship led by the hated Jewish banksters with capital in Jerusalem, and then proceeding to wipe out the Goys so that the Jewish population can have the world to itself. Madness. F. Global poverty elimination. Another consequence of living in a nation-state system is that the terrible inequality of wealth around the world is not seen sufficiently as the moral injustice that it is. There are nation-states with over $40,000 average income per year per person, and there are many other nation-states with citizens who earn less than $1 a day. Some of the world's citizens sail their yachts, while others live in squatter hovels and favelas. In a nation-state system, the loyalty of citizens tends to extend only as far as the nation-state. Within the nation-state, feelings of economic justice are used to justify progressive taxation and welfare state provision, so that the poor of that nation-state do not become too poor. Some countries are particularly effective at keeping the wealth distribution within a nation-state fairly even, for example in Sweden, Holland and Japan, but much less so in countries like Brazil, China and the US. What is needed in an increasingly global era is the extension of these feelings of economic justice to the planet. Money needs to be invested in the poor countries so that they too can become rich. It's also in the rich countries' self-interest that they become rich, because then they will be able to buy the rich countries' products. All boats will rise. The EU is pioneering the extension of economic justice beyond the nation-state. It applies these ideas to the members of the EU. Poorer EU countries get more aid than richer ones. In fact, richer ones tend to pay out more than they bring in. They do this because they agree with the idea of solidarity, that is, helping the poorer guy stand on his feet economically. Europeans say of the Americans that, quote, "The Americans don't understand solidarity, no national health service, the death penalty, etc." Admittedly, the Americans created the Marshall Plan soon after World War II to kickstart the economies of Western Europe and Japan. But this was not so much for interests of solidarity, but more for self-interest. The Americans didn't want Western Europe and Japan to fall into the Stalinist camp, as they might have if they had remained as poor as they were immediately after the war, and hence ripe for Marxists to persuade them to become communist. What the Europeans are pioneering on their union scale needs to be broadened to the global scale, step by step. For example, the EU already has economic agreements with its neighbours in the North African nations. By trading with them under fairer conditions, these countries get more prosperous. In time, they may become true democracies and modern in their attitudes and values. They will then be considered more favourably as potential new members of the EU. But if that happens, the EU would have to change its name. It would no longer be a European institution, as discussed already in Chapter 8, Section B. G. Global taxation. To finance the removal of global poverty, a global tax needs to be created. This would be the obvious job of the global state. All states need to tax their citizens to pay for the collective expenses, like schools, roads, hospitals, etc. The global state will be no different. Taxes have been with us for so long that there's even an expression in English that says there are only two certainties in life: death and taxes. Once a global state is created, its global members can then decide on a global taxation policy based on the above principles, that is, to foster a global solidarity, to remove global poverty, and to promote global education, one of the next topics to be discussed. Presumably, the same kind of principles that are applied to individual nation states can be applied to the planet. That is, that the richer people, that is, richer nations, will pay a proportionally higher global tax rate than the poorer people, that is, the poorer nations. This could have a huge impact on the poorest nations, because the richest nations are hugely richer than the poorest nations. So the tax money from the rich nations would be a lot for the poor nations. By ridding the world of expenditure on arms, there would be a lot more money for the economic development of the poor nations. H. Global incomes and raw materials policy. How could the world's wealth be distributed? This is a basic ethical question that any global government this century will have to face. In a global state that is a federation of nation-states, it's likely that the nation-states would be more selfish than a truly global state that is not a federation, but a single state. Of course, there are federations and federations. Some are more heterogeneous than others. The US, Canada, Australia are all federations of states in very large countries in surface area terms. The states in each of these countries have their own tasks, while the federal governments have their own tasks. For example, the state governments take care of education, roads, hospitals, etc. The federal government takes care of defence, international diplomacy, etc. In a non-federal global state, the former nation-states would be merged into one global single state, a global superstate. Of course, for administrative reasons, the former nation-states would still need to have some degree of administrative control, but not at the level of global incomes and raw materials policy. That would be for the global state. In a truly global state, there would be much less nation-state selfishness and self-interest compared to what is normal at the time of writing. The decisions of the global state would be for the global benefit, not for the benefit of a single nation-state. If that becomes the case, then what principles would apply to the incomes policy and raw materials policy of the global state? I think the answers are fairly obvious. A. The global lawmakers would have under their jurisdiction the whole planet, and no one region or former nation-state would be favoured above another. B. Global taxes would be distributed on a pro rata basis. That is, if there were $1 trillion in global taxes collected, then that money should be spent equally per person across the planet, with the exception of the progressive taxation measures mentioned earlier. Perhaps more sophisticated formulas would need to be formulated given the international differences in purchasing powers. C. The raw materials of the globe belong to the citizens of the globe. No former nation-state is favoured. That is, the fact that a particular raw material happens to lie under the ground of a given former nation-state is no justification that that raw material belongs to the former nation-state. It belongs to the planet. These principles will probably raise lots of objections. For example, why would a given nation-state that stands to lose a lot of money in such a surrender of sovereignty, for example the Arabs and their oil, want to join a global state? The answer is that as people's mentalities become more global, they will think more in terms of global solidarity than nationalistically. They will come to think of citizens of other countries less as foreigners, but more as global citizens and fellow travellers. If global taxes are distributed on a pro rata basis, that is, the same amount of money per person, independently of which former nation-state that person lives in, then the citizens of the poorest countries would get a lot of money compared with what they are used to. Wouldn't that largesse make them lazy and demotivate them to work? They could simply welsh off the state. There is some truth to this objection, so the distribution of the wealth to the poorest countries would need to be done carefully so that willingness to work, taking initiatives and expressing an entrepreneurial spirit is not dampened. Perhaps the money would be better invested in infrastructure and schools and hospitals and not given as simple handouts. As global solidarity increases, the claim that the raw materials lying under the ground in country X belong to the citizens of country X would weaken in strength. At the present time, for example, the iron ore, coal, uranium, etc. deposits situated in various states of Australia are not considered to belong to only the citizens of those states, but to the citizens of the whole country. In a global state, the same kind of logic would apply to global citizens, that is, citizens of the global state. The logic is the same, only the scale has shifted up from the nation-state to the planet. I. Global education. One of the major reasons why third world countries are third world is because their citizens are third world in their minds. That is, they are poorly educated, ignorant, illiterate, mean-spirited, dishonest, deceitful, thieving and resentful, particularly when they see for themselves the wealth of the rich countries on television and movies. A bitter sense of resentment is generated. A major item on the agenda of a growing global state would be the education of the world citizen. With modern and near-future technologies, it should be possible to broadcast very high bit-rate signals from satellites to the whole planet and to distribute them for free, cheap but effective receivers. This could have a huge effect on the planet and for globism. Consider the impact. For a moderate price, the whole planet could then be educated, and with people learning at their own pace, the whole planet could learn the world language and would then have access to the world's knowledge, mostly expressed in the world language. This would bring down dictatorships, so it's likely that in the short term the leaderships of the dictatorial regimes would not agree to such a scheme. Most dictatorships, except China, do not have the space technology to counter such a scheme, that is, to shoot down the education satellites, EdSats. These dictatorships could attempt to ban the ownership of such receivers, but if they could be made very small, a thriving black market would soon give everyone a receiver. They would be easy to smuggle in and difficult to detect. Only China, amongst the remaining dictatorships, has the space technology to shoot down the satellites that could transmit such knowledge. Recent tests by the Chinese government have shown that they are capable of doing it. If the Chinese government did shoot down education satellites, which the Chinese government would label as propaganda satellites and infringers of Chinese national sovereignty, then the rest of the world could put enormous moral, economic and political pressure on the Chinese leaders to allow the transmissions. Ad-libbing. In the 10-year period since I wrote this, my thinking has changed somewhat. I tend to look now more on the combination of the internet, because the internet has BRAD, remember, bit rate annual doubling. So the signal processing rate of the internet just keeps doubling every year. And the use of VPNs, virtual private networks, that's software to go